Well, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is still under fire. He gave an interview to Fox and Friends. We covered some of it yesterday morning just as we were reacting in real time as it had recently happened. But there's so much more to get to, including, I think, a real bombshell from Ryan and Drop's site about what's going on behind the scenes at the Pentagon. This report explains a lot. But let's start with this clip from Pete Hegseth on Fox and Friends yesterday morning, trying to defend himself amidst all of these firings.
That's why I've fought for the budget that the Defense Department requires. And the president has said we'll have our first $1 trillion budget because my kids, my 14-year-old, if he joins, he's going to have a great military. He's going to have peace through strength because of the historic investments of this president. So, no, I haven't blinked, and I won't blink because this job is too big and too important for the American people, and I'm grateful for every opportunity the president has given me.
And I was grateful to see the Hegseth army on the Easter egg roll yesterday in the backdrop. They are ready to go.
Okay, so Pete Hegseth went on Fox and Friends to defend himself amidst what we've been covering here. It's a major story. All of these terminations of his very, very close staff, people who have been around him for a long time, just in recent days, over allegations of a leak. So one of the things we covered here yesterday, just to catch up if you didn't see the edition of Breaking Points yesterday, is that Dan Caldwell, again, this is a very senior advisor to Pete Hegseth, someone who's been around him, I think going back to their Concerned Veterans for America days, really long time. Dan is terminated, walked out of the Pentagon, along with another guy who's been around Hegseth for a long time, pretty high up in the circles at the Pentagon these days. I think the total comes to like 5 major departures, one of which, Uliat, is sort of anti-Hegseth and more in neocon camp, but just around Hegseth himself, 4 people who are sort of allies to him have left the Pentagon recently. Caldwell then goes on Tucker Carlson's show, says he absolutely did not leak. He has no idea if there is an investigation into a leak. And then Ryan comes out at Drop Site with a story that I think blew this wide open yesterday, Krystal. So let's put the next element up on the screen. So what Ryan is reporting basically is that, the narrative itself and Ryan's writing is so good, but this is just an insane story. But what happened basically is that, let me summarize it this way. The paranoia about being caught leaking at the Pentagon is so strong that people are getting falsely accused of leaking because there's such a freak out about whether or not anybody is leaking. So think of it like this, and just to go through Ryan's story quickly. So on April 3rd, Colin Carroll gets a phone call, and it is from Dan Littman. So Politico reporter Dan Littman, who had recently written a story, kind of a hit piece on Carroll, calling him a, quote, bad boss. I don't mean hit piece in necessarily a pejorative way, but it was, negative.
It was negative.
Piece. Yeah, exactly. So Carroll texts Dan Caldwell to tell him about this call with Littman. Littman had asked if Joe Casper was facing an investigation by an IG, and he wanted to know if Carroll could confirm that. So you have a reporter calling someone at the Pentagon and saying, hey, do you know about Joe Casper being under investigation? So he then texts Caldwell being like, what do I do with this? I don't want to be accused of leaking. Like, that is the fear, and says, I just had a Politico reporter call me and asked to comment on an ongoing IG and criminal investigation into Casper. I told him no comment. Same reporter that did a hit piece on me 2 weeks ago for getting fired for bad leadership last time around. I feel like I should report this call to someone, but not sure who, given the leak and disclosure stuff. This is an amazing signal message that Ryan has in this story. Ryan's sourcing here is just incredible. Caldwell replies, flag it for your PAO, and then Sean Parnell, who does comms at the Pentagon. So that all happens. And basically, then Carroll, Caldwell, and the Deputy Chief of Staff, Darren Selnick, get marched out of the Pentagon and subsequently fired and accused of leaking information. So, Krystal, this story, again, it is insane. It is like ripped from an episode of Veep. But the takeaway here is they're so paranoid about being caught leaking that even when they're not leaking, they're getting accused of leaking. Even when they're paranoid, when they're trying to cover all of their bases, they're still being accused of leaking.
So just basically their association with this Politico reporter and the fact that they surfaced this created this impression of, oh, you're leaking and you're trying to sabotage Joe Casper in particular. So and it also feels like Casper is, there's all kinds of stories out about him at this point. He seems like, you know, a real, we'll just say, wild card. Apparently he's in high level meetings, bringing up exploits at strip clubs, announcing to everybody that he's just taken a giant shit. Like, that's the level of leadership that we're talking about from that dude in particular. But it seems like he was also looking for a pretext to fire and knife some of these people. So then when they get associated inadvertently with this political reporter and this potential leak coming out of the Inspector General's office with regard to Joe Casper, he potentially sees this as an opening of like, oh, this is how I'm going to get these guys out of here. So some of this is just complete insanity and paranoia. Yeah. You know, very poor leadership in terms of Pete Hegseth, clearly, like that's just undeniable at this point. Some of it is potentially ideological. That's the piece that we don't really know. And it sort of doesn't matter whether it's ideological or not, because the end result is that you've got Dan Caldwell out, who was a really important voice for, you know, restraint with regard to Iran and not going along with Israel and what they want the United States to do. So whether or not it's ideological, it has an ideological impact. And then some of this just seems like, you know, people who don't like each other and turf wars and like kind of bureaucratic bullshit run amok because you have such a weak and ineffectual and chaotic leader in the person of Pete Hegseth.
So Caroline Leavitt was asked about this yesterday at the White House briefing. Let's roll a clip. I should say, just she wasn't asked about the drop site story. I don't think it had come out by the time the briefing happened. But let's take a look at her answers to questions about Pete Hegseth.
I have two questions, one on the Pentagon and another on the economy. You said on Fox News that the entire Pentagon is working against Secretary Hegseth, but the people who were fired were Hegseth's own guys. So how do you square that, and what do you say to concerns that that's bad management?
They were Pentagon employees who leaked against their boss to news agencies in this room, and it's been clear since day one from this administration that we are not going to tolerate individuals who leak to the mainstream media, particularly when it comes to sensitive information. And the Secretary of Defense is doing a tremendous job, and he is bringing monumental change to the Pentagon. And there's a lot of people in this city who reject monumental change, and I think, frankly, that's why we've seen a smear campaign against the Secretary of Defense since the moment that President Trump announced his nomination before the United States Senate. Let me reiterate, the president stands strongly behind Secretary Hegseth in the change that he is bringing to the Pentagon, and the results that he's achieved thus far speak for themselves.
And Krystal, I want to bring up this New York Times rundown that published yesterday because it gets to the points you made about Joe Casper, some of the allegations about how he conducts himself at the Pentagon, bringing up conversations about strip clubs, and then
the literal shit show, apparently.
This New York Times story has all kinds of details from behind the scenes, but Joe Casper, Hegseth has stood behind, and what's very interesting about that is the question that I believe that was Dasha Burns just asked Caroline Leavitt. It's as though there has been a wedge driven between Hegseth's own allies inside the Pentagon. And if you are Pete Hegseth, and I'm just speaking hypothetically, you come into the Pentagon hypothetically and sort of charitably. Like, say you're Pete Hegseth, you have these goals that you want to accomplish at the Pentagon. You really want to do some reform, whatever that reform is. You, let's just say, want to bust up a status quo that has been around for a long time and is very hard to disrupt. What's very predictable is that the sort of forces that you're trying to reform and disrupt are going to drive a wedge between yourself and your allies. Because, again, we talked about this when Hegseth was first nominated. Basically, nobody, even in the private sector, has the experience that you need to be the defense secretary because it's such a vast job. It's your oversight is just over such a vast swath of the economy, of the sort of global security apparatus. It's a really, really difficult job. And even if you led Concerned Vets and you're a Fox and Friends host, it just there's nothing that can prepare you, whether you're that or you're Jamie Dimon. Like, nothing can prepare you for what's going to happen at the Pentagon, let alone if you want to reform it. So I think some of this, Krystal, is really like bad faith, neoconservative defenders of the status quo trying very hard to push Hegseth out and replace him with somebody who's more along the lines of like a Mike Waltz or a Mike Pompeo. So I as wild as the sort of, or let's just say as unorthodox as Hegseth is as a defense secretary, I mean, I think some of this is just like the predictable machinations of the neoconservative blob that operates inside of the Pentagon. And it was always going to happen. And that's, I mean, it's sort of, it's a very difficult job. And as much as like Hegseth has made some pretty obvious mistakes, Signalgate being the clearest, man, this is a mess, and I don't know. I don't know what's. It doesn't make me feel great about what's happening at the Pentagon.
That doesn't make you feel great.
Doesn't make me feel great, Krystal.
I mean, I don't know. I'm going back to the first clip where you played where he's like bragging about, oh, we're going to have $1 trillion defense budget. It's like, okay, where's the big break with the status quo? I get it. He talked about DEI and wokeness a lot. And,
he wanted to get rid of like a bunch of those guys. You know what I mean? Like the generals that have been around for a really long time. Like he wanted to clean
but now
house
we're just like reinflating the budget and making it bigger than ever. So I'm not all that sympathetic to the narrative that he really is, that he has really had this grand evolution in terms of his ideology and is really pushing in a different direction than what we've seen before in terms of fighting wars, endlessly around the world. I just don't think that I think he is an ambitious guy. I think, when it was the thing to do to get ahead to be in favor of the Iraq war, he did that. When it was the thing to do to get ahead to be in favor of the Ukraine war, he did that. When it was the thing to do to get ahead to turn on the Ukraine war, he did that. And now he's going to do whatever Trump wants him to do. That's what I ultimately.
True. He's definitely not going to push back on Trump. Yeah.
No, we know that. I mean, we saw it in the Signalgate, in the chats that we all got access to. And then I don't know if we've covered on the show or not. There is another Signalgate controversy now where he was including his wife and his brother with this sensitive information that had been shared with him. We know it was classified because it was shared with him from a general who shared it through the proper classified channels. So, and the reason to share these things via Signal is because you can evade any sort of government transparency. That's the reason they do this. They never said they were going to stop using Signal, and I'm sure they've continued to use it routinely, et cetera. And, there is like a basic level. Let's take seriously the idea he's a revolutionary, really wants to change the direction of the Pentagon, et cetera, et cetera. Like, that does mean, to your point, that you need to be even more locked down, competent, efficient.
Yeah, exactly.
Like all of it versus this, chaos, paranoia mess that has apparently been fomented at the Pentagon. So if you want to do some sort of revolutionary action, you better have all of your ducks in a row, because of course the neocons and the people that are in the entrenched status quo are going to be coming for you, and you can bet that they are organized. So, I personally don't give a lot of credence to the narrative about his big ideological shift, but even if you do, that makes it even more important that he be a hyper competent person. And there was never any evidence of that, frankly. Never any evidence of that. There were mismanagement problems at his, Concerned Vets organization. Being a Fox and Friends weekend host, doesn't require you to manage personnel whatsoever. And so the shortfalls in terms of his basic level of leadership and competence are even more important if he is trying to truly do something different here.
And we can put the last element on the screen because this gets to the point that you're making about to what extent Pete Hegseth is able or willing or interested in reforming the Pentagon. Donald Trump posted on Truth Social yesterday, quote, "I've just spoken to Prime Minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, relative to numerous subjects, including trade, Iran, etc. The call went very well. We are on the same side of every issue." Now,
cool, great, love that.
Krystal,
every issue.
And this speaks to how serious, I guess, the tensions because what is genuinely different or was genuinely different about a Hegseth Pentagon is that he surrounded himself with people like Dan.
Right.
Dan Caldwell is somebody who would look at that Truth Social post and say, this is ridiculous. We're on the same side of every issue. This is a huge problem with American foreign policy. And for a Republican or Democrat administration, frankly, to have deep skeptics of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, especially as it pertains to the Middle East, especially as it pertains to Russia, in such a senior role, that was genuinely different. And it was, whether it would have translated into massive substantive differences. I mean, we saw this on the Signalgate chat itself when J.D. Vance pushed back a little bit. It was Pete Hegseth who jumped in and made the argument on behalf of Trumpism, basically, for the Houthi strike. And so whether it would have translated down the line into big substantive differences, we don't know. The early signs suggested that it wouldn't. But this is the sort of like classic Trumpian dilemma, or not dilemma, but one of the big questions is whether his, I guess, stylistic gestures that he's willing to make on things like organized labor, with Chavez DeRemer being in support of the PRO Act, or formerly being in support of the PRO Act, all of these different things, do they ever translate into sort of substantive, or trade war, for example? Does he end up going, like, blinking on these tariffs and, pissing off Wall Street so much that he ends up placating Wall Street? Like, these, we just don't, you never have a good sense of how serious he is about actually reforming the status quo. And in this case, the potential reformers have been pushed out the door, 3 months into the administration?
Yeah. And I mean, bottom line, this goes again to, how much Pete Hegseth really cares about going in some different direction. He fired maybe the best guy that he had around him on these issues, the best voice against war with Iran. One of the best was Dan Caldwell, and Pete Hegseth is the guy that fired him. So, what are we to make of how committed he is to a different ideological direction? And, these things matter because Trump can be very impressionable.
Yes.
You see that certainly in the tariff fight, where Besant and Lutnick realize that if they can get Peter Navarro on the other side of the White House in some other meeting, they can come in and they can, make their case, and they can effectuate some sort of action just from them being there and Peter Navarro not being there. So that's why it is very consequential who is in the room. And to see that tweet from Trump saying, "Oh, we're on the same side of every issue with Israel," like, that is just, it's just so preposterous. We should not be on the same side of every issue of any country in the whole world. Like, the whole idea of America first is you have your own interests, right? And that's kind of the polar opposite of what is being conveyed in the tweet. And it's deeply troubling because obviously Israel wants us and has long wanted us in a war with Iran, even though many of, even Mike Waltz acknowledged that, it would be a risky gambit to try to take Iranian nuclear facilities through military means. So, you have a lot of Americans who realize that this would be a bad direction, but that doesn't mean that you aren't going to have, you aren't going to have a lack of patience for Trump to pursue the diplomatic process. And at the end of the day, the neocons be able to catch him in a moment when, whoever is a voice of reason is on the other side of the White House, and persuade him into taking really dangerous and horrifying action. Yeah,
I think your point about the importance of having people in the room who are skeptics or kind of heterodox on these questions is really, really well taken and important.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.